Hello and welcome to this edition of Ritter's Rant. Today we're going to be talking about the law of war. Um, I think everybody by this time has heard about the horrific attack that took place at Starobelsk College, Teachers College, part of the Lugansk University network. And I think 21 students between the age of 16 and 18, mostly girls, some boys, were murdered in this attack. President Putin has articulated an action by the Ukrainian enemy that involved multiple waves of drones attacking. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a drone that had gone off course. This was a deliberate act of murder carried out by Ukraine against innocent civilians. Now, Russia has responded and will continue to respond. As this video is being made, the Russian government is announcing that they are going to continue strikes against Kiev. They've advised diplomatic missions to leave the city and civilians to leave the city. So, it appears that an appropriate response to the crime that has been committed, will take place. But what's interesting is not what the Russian government's doing per se, because that's logical. It's how the West has treated this attack, which is illogical. There are many in the West who continue to believe that Ukraine was justified in carrying out this action, that this was a legitimate target under the law of war. People like Jeff Fisher, former Air Force colonel, current CEO of Fisher Aerospace, based out of Poland, a man who makes his living today promoting the war in Ukraine and profiteering off the war in Ukraine. Has put out posts on social media that show, Ukrainian children in military uniform linked to the Starobelsk school network. And he says, this is proof that this was a military target. They put out videos that show, Ukrainian or Russian military personnel at the university talking to people in the classroom. Proof. But is it really proof? I mean, what do the images show? They show, the Ukrainian children participating in an annual competition that has a military aspect to it, but which is not a military competition. It's a competition of physical fitness, teamwork, etc. But it doesn't matter. The law of war prohibits civilians from being targeted. And these kids, these children, even though they wear a military uniform, are not active duty combatants by the law of war. They're civilians. And it's just a one-time event. It's not like they're part of a junior ROTC program or an ROTC program. But even if they were, the law of war protects them. They're civilians. They're not on active duty. And the college itself is protected as a civilian institution of higher education. But Jeff Fisher and the other warmongers out there, that's not how they operate. And this is important because, you see, they're part of a system. They're part of a system that justifies the war in Ukraine and facilitates the ongoing actions. And it gives us insight. Because if the simplistic brain of Jeff Fisher can look at these photographs and, breathe ill intent into them, what happens when, for instance, Palantir applies its artificial intelligence technologies to the problem of developing targets for an expanded Ukrainian drone campaign against Russia, one that is promoted by the British, who are seeking to use the drone campaign to break the spirit of the Russian people, waging mental war against the Russian people because they can't win the war on the battlefield. So they're going to try and win the war in the minds of the Russian people. In order to do that, you have to attack a lot of targets. England's talking about providing Ukraine with 16 to 20,000 drones this year. Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, is speaking about a massive drone campaign over the course of the month of June to include the possibility of launching up to 6,000 drones a day against Russia. Don't know if he can achieve that, but just think about that for a second. 6,000 drones, that implies 6,000 points on the ground, 6,000 targets. Where do you get those targets? As somebody who's done targeting in my lifetime, I know that to do it responsibly, You have to look at the target, assess the target, gather intelligence information about the target, and ascertain whether the target has genuine military connectivity as a legitimate target under the law of war. Make sure that you make distinction between potential civilian applications, and then you also look for proportionality. Even if it's a legitimate target, if we bomb it, do we achieve a disproportional result on innocent civilians? These are things that the human brain runs through, a human brain empowered by knowledge and information that's promulgated in laws of war manual, international humanitarian law, the Geneva Conventions, the human connection. But what Palantir is promoting isn't the human connection, but artificial intelligence, which isn't really intelligence. It's just basically a giant computer being programmed to do things with obvious outcomes. So rather than having somebody scan through a database and look at a photograph and say, aha, people in uniform at Star Bells College, let's dig deeper. Oh, it's just a civilian war game. These aren't military people. It's a one-time event. The college has no relationship to military activity or the war in Ukraine. Therefore, it is a civilian target protected. We don't attack. But now if you just tell the computer, find evidence of military connectivity, it sees a photograph, sees a uniform, sees the name Star Bells College, and says, this is a target. We are going to attack it. That appears to be what happened. That the Ukrainians, using Palantir-related targeting data, selected this target to be struck. So now we go to how they attacked it and what they attacked it with. It appears they used what's known as an FP1 drone. FP Firepoint is a company created by a Ukrainian grifter to bilk billions of dollars from the West, et cetera. But they do produce equipment like FP1. FP1 is basically a wooden, glued together drone made from Chinese components that has proven to be very effective. It is the number one drone used to attack. If you see drones hitting buildings in Moscow, it's an FP1. If you see a drone striking an oil facility in Russia, it's an FP1 drone. If drones fly over St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, they're probably going to be FP1 drones. It's a mass-produced drone of some capability. Now, the Ukrainians have taken these drones and they've also put air-to-ground rockets on them. So each FP1 drone can have 3 to 6 rockets that are then fired. So the drone has a double effect. It can fly in, fire rockets, and then peel off and come in and attack the target. Why is this important? Because some people believe that maybe these drones just went off target, that they didn't know what to do. But the eyewitness accounts from the students who were attacked say they heard rockets fired. They saw rockets coming in. FP1 drone is a propeller-driven light aircraft. So obviously these are FP1 drones with rockets on board. That means that somebody's watching the target, because those rockets don't fire themselves. Somebody's watching the target. And we know that this is the case because one of the drones found a small Starlink antenna of the kind that's used for command and control to relay back to a ground control station that's watching the target, orchestrated attack. So there's a Ukrainian set of eyes on target telling the drones to fire rockets into this school. And it wasn't just a one-time deal. They fired, rolled back as students came out, fired again, rolled back as students came out, fired again. And then once they've exhausted all their rocket supply, the 4 drones, bang, 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 into the building, collapse in the building, killing 21, injuring scores, mass murder, a war crime beyond belief. This was a carefully orchestrated criminal action by Ukraine and their British masters, because you see this campaign, this attack, is part of a larger effort by the British called Keeping Ukraine in the Fight that has an important psychological component. It's not about defeating Russia on the battlefield. Ukraine can't do that. It's about collapsing the will of the Russian people to continue the war. And this is what is happening here. This drone campaign being run by the British, orchestrated by the Ukrainians, is designed to wear down the Russian people. But I think they failed. One could call this almost a Pyrrhic victory. You see, they launched an attack against the school and they murdered civilians. But that's, from their standpoint, it's okay. You see, the Ukrainians and the British are operating from the Pete Hegseth model of warfare. More lethality, less legality, or in this case, no legality. So killing innocent girls while they sleep is a good thing from the Ukrainian perspective because they believed that the Russian people would buckle. They believed that the Russian people would lose the will to fight. They believed that the Russian people would surrender psychologically. But just the opposite is happening today in Russia. There's more anger than you can possibly believe. And the Russians aren't saying stop the war, they're saying win the war. And that appears to be the direction that the Russian government's heading. But the Russian government will follow the law of war. Every target struck by the Russian government will be linked to Ukrainian military activity, command and control activity, defense industry activity. Let's get back to the FP-1 drone. Why did Russia strike some of the targets they struck when they hit Kiev? For instance, a museum, a shopping center. People say those are civilian targets. The FP-1 drone is produced in Ukraine in facilities Ukrainians acknowledge are secret. They have to keep them secret and they have to keep them hidden because otherwise Russia would destroy them. And most of these facilities are hidden in civilian buildings, in garages, in basements, in halls that otherwise would be considered for civilian use only, but now they've been converted into a drone manufacturing point. So when you see a burned out museum, understand that the Ukrainians were using that museum to produce the very drones that attacked and murdered 21 innocent girls and boys at the Star Bells College. When you see a shopping center blown up, understand that the garages in that shopping center were used to produce the FP-1 drones that attacked and murdered these innocent civilians. When you see something that's called a civilian target burning, it's because it wasn't a civilian target. It's because the Ukrainians have violated the law of war by bringing defense industry into what should be a civilian facility, hiding behind a human shield. But the Russians, they don't kill civilians. They blow up these factories, but they did it in a way that minimized human casualties on part of the Ukrainians, unlike the Ukrainians, who maximized the human tragedy of the Star Bells College by deliberately murdering sleeping girls and boys in an attack that had no legitimacy under the law of war, no military benefit, purely murder. Murder. Well, that's my rant. Next time a thought crosses my mind, I'll be sure to let you know. Hello, and welcome to this episode of Ritter's Rant. Today, I'll be talking about what I call the Karaganov fallacy. Of course, I'm making reference to the esteemed Russian political scientist Sergei Karaganov, a man whom I have the highest respect for, whom I've had a conversation that we've published on the Russia House. Obviously, because I'm talking about it, he's a man I listen to, and I weigh his words very, very carefully because he is a very serious individual whose words are listened to and acted on sometimes by the senior-most elements of the Russian government. So, in short, when Sergei Karaganov speaks, if you're a serious student of Russia, you have a duty and obligation to listen. So when I push back on what I call the Karaganov fallacy, it's not meant to be insulting to Mr. Karaganov. It's actually meant to compliment him because much of what he says is true. You see, in the lead up to Victory Day, Mr. Karaganov gave an interview in which he talked about the posturing that's being done by Europe today, the very warlike posturing, to include incorporating threats of nuclear war against Russia. We're talking about a reimagining of nuclear weapons and nuclear doctrine by Europe that is openly hostile to Russia and Russian interests. Europe is speaking of actively preparing for war against Russia come 2029, 2030. The rhetoric that comes out of Germany today is reminiscent of the rhetoric that came out of Germany in the 1930s. It's not something that Russia, especially on the eve of Victory Day, can tolerate. And Russia would be a fool to sit by and do nothing while Europe not only prepares for war, but is actively engaged in warlike operations against Russia today. One has to understand that the recent wave of attacks carried out by Ukraine using long-range drones are attacks that are openly facilitated by Europe. Germany, Great Britain, France, Denmark, and others are building these drones. Their factories exist in areas that Russia can't touch, and are providing these drones together with the intelligence information that allows these drones to be targeted, and then facilitating the routes used by these drones by creating corridors through Poland and the Baltic states or through Azerbaijan, the Caspian Sea, through Kazakhstan into the center of Russia that bypasses Russia's normal air defense. And it has created a strategic vulnerability for Russia that is unsustainable, not only unacceptable, but unsustainable, meaning that left uh, unattended to, this problem could become, literally a life and death issue for Russia, existential in nature. So Sergei Karaganov is right to point out the dangers that exist. But his solution is one that raises eyebrows. For some time now, Sergei Karaganov has said that Russia need not fear nuclear war, that Russia has a nuclear arsenal, and when threats arise of an existential nature, such as a resurrected fascist type mentality in Europe, that Russia would be right to use nuclear weapons to nip this in the bud decisively. He rightfully points out that you can only change the mindset of Europe by terrorizing Europe, by making Europe understand that there are horrific consequences for their actions, for their intended deeds. And Mr. Karaganov has said that he believes that the United States, which, for decades has provided some sort of nuclear guarantee, a nuclear umbrella to Europe, the United States is not going to sacrifice, Boston or Chicago for Poznan or London. That the United States isn't going to come to the assistance of Europe if Europe has done something to warrant a Russian response. I'm not saying that Sergei Karaganov is wrong. It's a hypothetical, and we sincerely don't know what the answer to that is. What I am saying is I personally am not willing to take that gamble. And I would advise Mr. Karaganov and others not to take that gamble likewise, because we don't know what would happen. What we do know, and we can take guidance from Russian military thinkers alike, that how Russia would respond to an American use of nuclear weapons against a strategic ally of Russia. Let's say, hypothetically, the United States were to use nuclear weapons against Iran. How would Russia respond? Clearly, it was not an attack against Iran, and Russia doesn't have a NATO-type treaty relationship that would require Article 5 automatic intervention. There is no obligation upon Russia to use nuclear weapons in response to American use of nuclear weapons against Iran. However, an American use of nuclear weapons would break the model of nuclear deterrence that has existed since the Cold War began. That is, that nuclear weapons should never be used. And the first side to use it, what you've done is you've altered this nuclear balance, because what you've done is you've turned the use of nuclear weapons away from a theoretical into a reality. You have upped the nuclear deterrence model to say we are proven to be able to use nuclear weapons, therefore you must fear us even more. Russia could not live in an environment where the United States was now walking around saying, we've used nukes, we'll use them again against you, you must back down. Russia would have to respond, and Russian military philosophers have said Russia would need to respond using nuclear weapons of its own, not against the United States, but against another target, say Europe. And now what you've done is you've created a nuclear exchange. Yes, it doesn't start out as an exchange between the United States and Russia directly, but you've created the notion of an exchange. And computer modeling based upon, most human behavioral models shows that once this exchange begins, it never ends. It will inevitably end up with a general nuclear exchange terminating all life on the planet. Now, I'm a newly minted grandparent. My daughter gave birth to a beautiful little girl, Marceline Salome, the little warrior of peace. And it's my duty and obligation as a grandparent to make sure there's a world for her to grow up in. Apti Aladanov, a good friend of mine, has said that he wanted his grandchildren to grow up in peace with my granddaughter. I joked with my daughters that I'd like to create a situation where maybe Apti Aladanov's grandson one day showed up at their home, knocked on the door, and said he'd like to take Marceline out on a date. Now, that's a problem that my daughter and her husband would have to deal with. That's their issue. My job, however, is to make that a possibility, to make sure that the world exists. And if we're talking about using nuclear weapons, this world will not exist. So I am against the Karaganov doctrine. but I'm not against the underlying concepts that he uses to justify this. What I would like to propose as an alternative to using nuclear weapons is to take a lesson from Iran. Iran has fought a 37-day war against the United States and Israel. It's a non-nuclear power, and it defeated two nuclear armed powers. How? By using ballistic missiles, conventionally armed ballistic missiles, to strike targets, to destroy targets. Russia has a weapon that nobody else has in the world, and this is the Oreshnik, an intermediate-range strategic missile with a conventional warhead that can deliver accurately a great destructive power. What I would propose to Sergei Karaganov is not to not attack Europe. I agree. Europe needs to be terrorized. The European population needs to feel terror because that is the only way they're going to stop their governments from doing what they plan on doing with Russia, to wage war against Russia. But using nuclear weapons isn't the answer. Nuclear weapons is a suicide pill. But the Oreshnik corollary to the Karaganov doctrine is the solution. Rain the Oreshnik down on European targets. Destroy the factories that produce the drones that are given to the Ukrainians to strike strategic targets inside Russia. Destroy decision-making centers if you must. This is the advantage of Russia. Europe has no ability to match this escalation, and Europe is not going to skip echelon going from conventional strike to nuclear interdiction, especially when the European nations understand that 2% of Russia's nuclear arsenal will destroy all of Europe. Europe cannot win a nuclear exchange with Russia, so Europe will never initiate a nuclear exchange with Russia, and the United States is not going to intervene nuclearly in this scenario. So, Sergei Karaganov, you are right, my friend. Europe needs to be taught a lesson sooner rather than later. I believe Europe has already committed egregious acts of violence against Russia that must be responded to. But the answer isn't to create the hypothetical trade-off of Boston for Poznan. Leave the United States out of this. Take the Oreshnik. Use the Oreshnik decisively. Strike terror into the hearts of Europe. But keep nuclear weapons out of the equation. This has been my rant. The next time an idea crosses my mind, I'll be sure to let you know.